Hello, my name is Chris Fall from the United States Department of Energy, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2020 Science and Technology and Society Forum and our panel session on energy and the environment. We're connected virtually this year because of the COVID crisis, and because we're connected virtually, we have, for example, avoided the impact to the planet of travel to Kyoto. And this is the essence of the very interesting question that SES has asked us to explore this year. The people of the world continue to battle the COVID-19 virus, and while the pandemic has overwhelmingly been a tragedy in many respects, with loss of jobs, loss of production, loss of freedom of movement, and even loss of friends and loved ones, the global pause has brought some benefits to the environment, amongst other things. In many places, the air is clean and clear for the first time in memory, and this has reminded many of what could be. And the potential for a global reset in our patterns of behavior presents some opportunities for a new normal that could lock in gains related to energy and the environment. Our task for this panel is to explore these challenges and opportunities that the pandemic presents to issues of energy and the environment. Joining us for the session are 8 experts from around the world. In the interest of time, I'm not going to introduce the panelists now all at once, but I'll do this as I ask questions of each of them. Meanwhile, their incredibly impressive biographies are available in the conference materials, and I believe that you'll find their pre-recorded presentations very interesting if you haven't viewed them already. A number of themes have emerged in our discussions from these presentations. We have indications that emissions and energy intensity have indeed dropped as a result of COVID. And our panelists have thoughts about how we might hold on to these gains even after COVID is over. Ideas about the role of technological solutions, ideas about government policy, thoughts about how the world might better capitalize on massive COVID-related stimulus programs. And they have offered insight into global organizations around world problems in energy and the environment and levers for effective change. It's a remarkable group, and I hope to get them to answer the deceptively simple question, will COVID-19 make our shared goal of a cleaner and more sustainable world easier or harder to realize? On behalf of the whole panel, I'd like to extend a thank you to Chairman Omi and the STS organization for inviting us all to participate and for continuing the work of the forum despite the COVID crisis. So let's go ahead and start with questions for the panel before we move on to discussion, and if there's time, questions from the participants in the audience. I'll just remind everyone of the need to keep discipline on time, and I apologize in advance if I need to interrupt in order to give everyone a chance to weigh in. And a final reminder to mute yourself after speaking. So the first question is to Professor Pavel Kabat. You're the chief scientist of the World Meteorological Organization. I really enjoyed the introduction that you recorded. Could you try to set for us the scale of COVID impacts? Many of us are still in various stages of isolation due to the COVID virus, and we certainly see far less activity around us in our daily lives. What has this meant for energy use and emissions exactly, and what strategies and concrete steps could help us to lock in COVID-related improvements if there are any?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Unfortunately, the situation we are starting from before COVID and even after COVID regarding climate change and emissions is not good at all. The latest report which organizations of UN published, we set up the numbers behind the challenge, and these are showing that, for example, the last 5 years are said to be the warmest ever measured. We know that the global emissions of the fossil CO2 rose by 60+% over the last 30 years. And we also know that the COVID promise, so to speak, because of course the lockdown, which we started to have somewhere in March, led to the quite large reduction of the emissions globally. The emissions around April, global one, were down to the 2006 level. But unfortunately, the emissions, of course, picked up at the moment the energy use was back. So we are now almost back to where we were before COVID. The prediction we are making are that this year, 2020, probably would end up 6% below the last year, but of course the trend is rising. So we have still a big challenge when it comes to the transition of the energy systems, of course, which is the most important. And there is, of course, enormous promise because technology, as we all know, made a huge progress. We know that, for example, the prices of kilowatt hour for renewables went down enormously, almost 80% for the photovoltaic over the last 8 years or so. So technologically, I think we have a lot of possibilities. Now, of course, the big question is how all these huge investments we are all making globally, currently about $18 trillion into the recovery packages after COVID, what kind of opportunities they would give us in terms of tackling the transition of energy systems more effectively. Technologically, I think there is a huge opportunity. However, we have looked into the way how these packages could be kind of translated into a green transformation, if you like. And currently, the estimate is quite there. I mean, out of the 18 trillion or 17 trillion, it looks like less than 5% could be labeled as the transformation investment to the fastening of the energy transformation. So it will not be only the technology which we have at hand. It will probably not be only the size of the economic investments, financial size of that. I think we would need to be very serious about other transformation. We should go hand in hand with the technology investment. This is, of course, coming to the institutional, governance, social, but also behavioral and cultural. I think the behavioral part of it is going all the way down to us, to individuals. And I think there the COVID experience, so to speak, could be really helpful. I mean, there is still not real scientifically clear how we would sort of reflect on our experience of COVID and how would we sort of change our behavioral, our feelings about the transition, but we believe that there is an opportunity. Last but not least, I think that when the system, so to speak, comes back after COVID, probably next year, the other issue will come back too, including the huge inequality globally regarding global emissions. I mean, it's interesting to look at the current picture. In the current picture, 10 top emitting countries, including EU, Bloc 28, is currently accounting for about 75% of all the emissions, while the bottom 100 countries globally only for 4. So the issue of leveling field and the equality will come back. And I think this is something which is putting the importance of the institutional governance transitions going hand in hand with the technology ones very important. So I will leave it here. The starting challenge is big. And unfortunately, we cannot say that the COVID itself kind of prompted a huge, big step towards the energy transformation. It will not stop climate change. We know it for sure. It will only sort of put us back a little bit in our frame of how to tackle this particular big challenge. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Pavel. So, Professor Jim Falk, you're at the University of Melbourne, and immediately prior to the opening of this STS forum, I understand that you chaired another important meeting focusing on actions we need to take to mitigate environmental problems. I wonder if you could describe the meeting and summarize the key outcome for us. And then I have a question for you, and that is, given your expertise in world governance of issues, including the environment, how has the COVID crisis impacted the agenda of those organizations?
Dr. Falk, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for that. Yes, on Friday, I chaired the Regional Action on Climate Change annual meeting, which is always held in conjunction with the STS Forum. And it's produced a particularly powerful statement, I think, this time, which can be now viewed on the STS website. And 2 words sum up the outcomes: convergence and integration. So the COVID pandemic is beginning to converge with impacts of climate change and other critical challenges. So one example would be in California, where evacuation from extreme wildfires, which are climate related, has been made much more difficult by COVID social distancing requirements. And there have been a similar situation in Japan with flooding. More broadly, we can see the increasing impact of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, stressed global health infrastructures, and stark inequalities coming together. The impacts are likely to reach a peak sometime around the projected peak global population in about 50 years, as cascading challenges to global, regional, and local security. So to be effective, responses to these escalating interlocked risks need to be integrated. That's the second word. Security won't be increased by mitigation without adaptation, nor will security be increased by adaptation without mitigation. Facing wildfires without capping climate change won't do it. Energy solutions which amplify the gap between rich and poor, or information rich versus information deprived, or create more greenhouse gas emissions, or destroy biodiversity are counterproductive. And there's a growing need for the environmental, public health and economics research and policy communities to begin working together to develop a much more unified framework for managing those risks, and for planners and communities to collaborate across the planet to implement it. And that brings us to your question, the second part of your question, because in relation to global institutions, managing the risks, global collaboration requires they be strong. And humanity has been pretty creative, actually, since World War II in building global institutions in an otherwise still fractured world, from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, IPCC, Paris Agreement, and of course the World Health Organization, whose genesis extends back to the World War I and the Spanish flu, which killed more people than the war. But even a decade ago, it was clear that World Health Organization was inhibited by global political competition, nationalism, tensions, and the capacity of these sorts of global initiatives have been insufficient. These capacities have not developed as fast as the global challenges, so that the World Health Organization, which has definitely evolved but still has insufficient authority, is inhibited by international tensions, as well as the multiplicity of agencies that deal with health, from the FAO to the World Trade Organization. The IPCC outputs, authoritative though they are, and a wonderful innovation, are slow to produce and advisory only. The Paris Agreement undertakings are not being fully implemented and undermined by the US withdrawal. And overall, despite Europe's efforts, the committed ambition is insufficient to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, or possibly, quite probably, even 3.5 degrees of warming. So the take home is, if we are to meet the converging dynamics identified in that RACC statement, then for the necessary international collaboration, we need to work hard to strengthen international institutions. Yes, at UN level, but also through every other mechanism, including corporate coalitions and international NGOs and everything else that we can do to achieve it, in order to provide the necessary integrated analysis and support for the required local and regional actions, including sufficiently rapid implementation of renewable energy technology, which hopefully immediately or in this year will utilise some of the economic stimulus from funds to implement it.
Okay, super, thanks. And let's actually turn a little bit to the question of technology and get that on the table. Professor Stan Whittingham, you won the Nobel Prize for your work on lithium batteries. In your recorded remarks, you've made the case for the key interacting technologies of renewable energy and storage. But of course, grid-scale storage remains a big challenge in terms of cost and performance. Has the disaggregation of the workplace due to COVID, a trend that maybe is transient or could be longer lasting, has this created any opportunity for penetration of batteries or other storage modalities? In other words, the techno-economic calculation might be different if patterns of life have changed, And so I wonder if distributed smaller scale storage and maybe even generation could be easier to realize in a more distributed work paradigm.
Thank you, and good day to everybody. Let me put in perspective where we stand at the moment. There are a number of areas where grid storage using batteries are economically viable today, and a lot of these are driven by resiliency. And I think we're going to need more resiliency with the COVID being around. Let me give you 3 examples. One are the Tesla batteries in South Australia that are making a very good return on the investment. And those are about 130 megawatt hours. And I think that was a bet between Musk and the government there. And he won out, and that's a success story. This past August, a 250 megawatt hour storage facility opened up in San Diego County. This is probably largest in the world at the moment. And in Los Angeles, there's a 1 gigawatt system going through permitting. So if the incentives are there, they're economically viable. And just up the road from me near Saratoga Springs in New York State, I think a 16 megawatt facility opened up 18 months ago. It's at a utility substation, and they buy power at night and sell it back when peak demand in the daytime. So in those specialized areas, there is an incentive to do it. People are making money, but obviously the best way of storing energy is pumped hydro if you're allowed to do it anymore. So I think for all the pumped hydro facilities, a little bit investment upgrading the pumps is probably the lowest cost way to go. In another area, the opportunities abound, I think, particularly in third world countries, for villages that are off the grid. They can build their own microgrid with solar and storage. And that should be fairly simple. And if you look at the impact of COVID itself, in the US, I think it has in fact disrupted storage installations, partly because local governments do not have the funds available anymore. But probably what I've seen is more important. They don't have the time and staff to issue the permits and get things going. Basically, everything is being delayed. So really, a federal stimulus could be a huge push to go greener and pushing resiliency against natural hazards, which we're going to get more and more of with the global warming, is an important aspect. And I just saw there's a book just came out of Columbia University with a grand plan for what the US government should do in the next 5 years. And I'll stop there, but really resiliency and stimulus are the key drivers for the future.
Super, thank you, sir. Mr. Satoshi Tsunekawa, you lead the Toshiba Group, which is maybe the definition of a company at the intersection of technology and society. What efforts are Toshiba Group making to contribute to mitigating environmental impacts through energy storage technology? And what other steps do you think that technology providers can take to lock in any positive effects of COVID on energy and the environment?
Thank you, Chairman. As the pandemic accelerates digital transformation, there's increasing demand for power infrastructure. That is both environmentally friendly and robust, and that realizes stable power supply. So technologies required for this robust power grid that cope with the wider use of renewable energies, and energy management systems, EMS, able to manage renewable energy fluctuations, and battery energy storage system that maximize the use of renewable energy, and building energy management systems that improve energy efficiency, and innovative hardware such as highly efficient solar cells and energy-saving air conditioning or lighting systems, and so on. If we are to expand the introduction of renewable energy, we also need to introduce ways to suppress sudden output fluctuations and use peak leveling to manage demand loads. Toshiba Group is doing with the highly performance SCIB lithium-ion battery, which is used as a module in stationary storage battery system. The SCIB is worth your attention. The latest generation 20 ampere hour product has a lithium titanate anode that delivers a long operating life with a little deterioration in performance, even after as many as 20,000 charge and discharge cycles. It charges very quickly to up to 80% of capacity in only 6 minutes. As more renewables are brought into the grids, SCIB-based solutions are increasingly used to support energy stabilization and load management. For a lithium-ion battery, it has a high input-output density, and its operating characteristics include a wide temperature range and low maintenance and small environmental impact. Finding it application in cars or automated or guided vehicles, buses, boats, and trains, as well as power applications. And that's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Rounding out our sort of group of technology, Dr. Bernard Bagot, you're responsible for the ITER Fusion Demonstration Project, which is the next big leap towards a sustainable energy future for the planet. No pressure. We hope you can save the world. COVID will surely impose at least a year of significant interruption to our lives. I wonder if COVID has had a significant impact to the construction of ITER, or whether ITER will be an example of how, with proper planning and execution, we can carry on with incredibly complex projects despite restriction imposed by a crisis like COVID.
Thank you very much, Chris. As you know, ITER is quite a challenging project, definitively, gathering 35 different nations which try to demonstrate the feasibility of hydrogen fusion and offer an option for substituting to fossil fuel and reducing the impact of our energy consumption on the climate and environment. Definitively, this COVID crisis was not expected when we launched this ITER project, but we tried to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 on our project. So far, we have been quite successful, I would say, with what we call a continuity plan in order to preserve all the critical activities we need to be managed. From my point of view, there is three I would say, lessons learned we get from this COVID-19. The first one is anticipation. The second one is mutual trust between all the stakeholders. You have to capitalize on what you have built on this matter. And the third one is reactivity. Anticipation, clearly we have a risk register. Clearly, we don't name it COVID-19, but due to the fact that, as you remember, maybe all the 7 members representing the 35 different countries are providing in kind their contribution from Japan, Korea, India, China, US, Russia, Europe, and so on. And so we saw very early the impact of the pandemic in China, and immediately we set up, I would say, a recovery plan. And we were quite pleased to see that all the stakeholders react accordingly. The second point is about what I said, so mutual trust. This program, as you know, is for 40 years and even more. So we had time to build trust between the members. And so when we request all the members to work accordingly, even if it was quite challenging from them, they accept our plan. And so I would recommend to build trust with sufficient anticipation in such a way when you have to react, you could rely on your people. And the third is reactivity. When we saw the pandemic coming in, immediately we set up a mitigation plan. We test, for example, the way all our people could go working remotely with teleworking. We have made some testing progressively. We will also select the way to implement some safety measure on the work site, and it has worked quite well so far. So from my point of view, it could be a good example on the way any large organization, and I do believe that in the future more and more large organization will be needed, could face some unexpected event as the COVID-19.
Well, thank you. Okay. So Dr. Lours has joined us. Dr. Amy Lours, you have a number of important roles as a thought leader at the intersection of society and the environment. I'm fascinated by your thoughts on what is effective and what is not effective when it comes to driving change, and particularly the role of digital technology. COVID has obviously led to a great deal of physical isolation of people, and for those who have access, dramatically more use of digital tools for connectivity. Is this an opportunity for increased effectiveness of grassroots organizations around energy and the environment? I think you might still be muted, Amy.
Yes, continued technical difficulties is not working out so well. So apologies for my for joining a bit late, and I think I joined to hear most of people's comments. It's wonderful to be here and be part of this discussion. Certainly the actions over the next few years will define our future in many ways in terms of how our climate future and sustainability and issues of equity as well. And one of the clear angles for defining that future at this moment in time, of course, are the investments in the recovery in terms of ensuring that the investments move towards the trillions of dollars that will be invested in the coming years will be invested towards in building a low carbon and zero carbon emission infrastructure for the future. And these have been mentioned in various other comments. The point that I wanted to highlight, though, were more on all the issues around that in terms of social, cultural, and governance norms that are, as you mentioned, will be affected by the digital world that we're in today. Things like thinking about the direction of our social norms have been disrupted in terms of, for example, how we don't typically get on a plane these days to travel across the world for a 3-hour meeting, even for a 3-day meeting. Thinking about this, the STS Forum, which I have gone to for years, and I think it's a great value of bringing people from different sectors addressing these issues together in person. But thinking through how do we engage, and how do we engage more people in these sorts of discussions? Not that we don't come in person, but rethinking how we do that, not just for this year, but moving forward. And I think we are all involved in so many engagements in that way. And we'll need to continue to discuss and think that through, because travel, of course, is such a huge part of our carbon budget. But another part of that is not just how we value travel and how we value seeing the other parts of the world. And I don't believe that should be eliminated completely by any means, but thinking through how those different pieces. But our values in terms of what is the sort of the status symbols that we see today. There's so many in our consumption society that have been focused on clothes, materials, that I think over the last 6 or 8 months, so many of us have been rethinking what is it that means so much to us, and what is that value of that are so critical that we want to prioritize. And I think that focuses us to think about, as we think about sustainability issues and issues of climate change, not just focusing on the efficiency of what we do, but thinking about the sufficiency. How can we move towards a world, a mindset of sufficiency from just efficiency? The other area that I think is connected to these as well is that idea of how do we engage people in conversations in participatory governance in new ways. These sorts of conversations that do open up to new communities does help us think about that and force us to think about that and do things rapidly, very quickly, change things rapidly. Of course, not everybody has access to the tools and the internet in the same way as everybody else. The digital divide is a huge issue. It's surprising how rapidly some of those challenges are being addressed in certain parts of the world, but certainly not rapidly enough for sure. But I think it really highlights how important overcoming that digital divide is, and thinking together about tackling those questions of the digital world and the natural world as an integrated part of our sustainability challenges. One thing I just want to say in closing on this is recently, actually right after the sort of explosion of the COVID crisis, we started a series of surveys, global surveys, to ask to kind of take a pulse of the globe, figure out how people are experiencing this over time, recognizing that we would be going through such a dramatic historical change. And one of the things we did ask is, does this experience have people around the world feel more engaged or more isolated from the global conversations, from those policy and big discussions that are affecting their lives? And overall, the answer was more engaged. And I think that's a promising sign as we look forward, but we can't just assume it's going to go in that direction. I think it's something we have to rethink more broadly about what are the opportunities and challenges of how we can do things differently. Thank you.
Super. Yes, a lot of time for reflection. All right, Dr. Malika Ishwaran, you represent the Shell Corporation, and major companies like Shell are typically excellent at strategic planning, but I wonder if a global pandemic is something that most companies would consider for one of their planning scenarios. Many companies traditionally centered around fossil fuels are imagining a future as energy companies more generally, including services such as generation and distribution, with a focus on renewable technologies. Will this global pause, maybe the global reset in some respects, impact those plans? And what can the role of massive government COVID stimulus packages be at the intersection of industry?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the STS Forum. It's really my pleasure to be participating in this panel discussion. Now, it's always, I think you can agree, incredibly hard to predict something like a global pandemic. But Shell has a long tradition in scenario planning to inform our long-term strategy. I'm part of that team, and actually 2020 marks 50 years of Shell scenarios. Now, it's a great tool for understanding disruptions like COVID-19 and how they might then play out over time. Now, we recently released a set of 3 scenarios called Rethinking the 2020s. And these basically look at different ways in which COVID could impact the way we live, the way we play, the way we work over the course of this decade, including how it could affect progress towards the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, one of the scenarios that is part of this suite of 3 explores how the pandemic could lead to a renewed focus on the notion of public good and common good, including the environment. But the other 2 scenarios explore sort of other drivers that might not be as aligned with sort of the environmental agenda. Now, coming to the second part of your question, Shell supports the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement and wants to play its part. And so our ambition is to be a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. So I think, we understand and recognize the challenge that this change in a relatively short 30-year period entails. So we use our scenarios again, and we have a global scenario called SKY that looks at what would it take for the whole global economy to achieve the Paris Agreement in the time that we have. So I think, again, decarbonizing the global economy in 30 years is challenging. And COVID has been a disruptor in the sense that we could end up losing a number of years this decade in an already sort of challenged timeline for achieving that goal. So I think, the economic recovery provides an opportunity to reset and refocus, economies, societies towards making the energy transition to low carbon. Now, the governments need to get creative and innovative in how they design their economic recovery packages so that it doesn't just support the recovery, but also simultaneously is supporting the energy transition. We're starting to see some of that come through in the measures that have been announced in Europe in particular, and at the European Commission level, as well as at the level of national governments. Now, at Shell, we think that the energy transition is inevitable. So it will happen. And we have reiterated our commitment to decarbonizing and also to stepping up our leadership in developing low carbon technologies, fuels, solutions that transform not just the energy supply, which we obviously play a strong role in, but also to help our customers transform how and the type of energy that they consume. So I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Shigehiro Tanaka, you're Vice Minister for Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, or METI. Public investment during a crisis such as COVID surely represents an opportunity to address longstanding challenges, as many of our panelists have suggested. But of course, individual citizens of our countries face economic hardship and are looking for immediate assistance. How should governments balance the needs of the present with the opportunities for a better future during this crisis?
Mr. Fall, indeed, the challenge that you just posed is exactly the kind of challenge that all the governments around the world is facing. Clearly, unless we overcome the present crisis, there will be no society or humankind to protect. At the same time, even if we overcome the present crisis, if we don't prepare for the future, again, we'll not have a future for the humankind that has, overcome the present crisis. So we clearly have to do both. There's been a lot of talk about this, the stimulus package. Clearly, Japan is one in terms of, preparing a stimulus package early on. And clearly, at the initial stage, there was much more focus put on the fact that we have to face the difficulties of the vulnerable businesses, the vulnerable people, by measures such as giving out cash grants or infusing some loan kind of supports. But clearly, we also see this as a huge opportunity to sort of accelerate the societal and also the industrial and also even the governmental change that has always been needed. Which will include not only being responsive to the climate change situation, but also how we digitalize the entire economy is now a very big agenda. Prime Minister Suga's one of the main agendas is to digitalize the whole economy, but this will also have a huge consequence for the climate change changes. And of course, we will also move on with disruptive innovations with the strategy that I also described in my video presentation. Including and not limited to the environment innovation strategy that we have published early on this year. But at the same time, I would like to point out that only talking about budgets and also talking about creating some new goals or just making new announcements is probably not enough to show our resolve to our strong will to tackle issues like climate change. In that regard, I would like to say that in July, the Japanese government has announced that we will be reducing and sort of fading out our inefficient, coal-fired plants all throughout the country to our 2030. The media is reporting that this will mean that more than 100 coal-fired plants will be closed. And I would like to remind you, this clearly has employment implications in a negative sense. And we did so regardless of this very difficult economic situation because we are fully aware that this climate change challenge is something that we cannot ignore even under this very difficult situation. And at the same time, we also have announced our connect and manage policies, meaning we are changing the way we run our grids, which is now resulting in generating almost 1/4 the size of our present grid that can be used for renewable energies that can come into play. So all these changes are taking place, which does not need much money. Although we are talking about, we used to talk about the stimulus package. There are other things that we can do, but of course, we need a political will, and sometimes we may have to overcome some political resistance. But Japan is fully prepared for that, and I just want to tell you that all sorts of efforts are going on, even at this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so those are our panelists, and we have a special guest today. Mr. Nadir Godrej has joined us to help facilitate our conversation and to provide some additional expert perspective. And but I would like to ask him a question to get started before his commentary. Nadir, you run a multinational corporation, so you're very aware of conditions around the world, but you also live in Mumbai in India. And so when it comes to energy and environmental issues, can you contrast the situation in countries like India with the more industrialized world, the wealthier world? And I guess rather than a paradigm of needing to reset, rebuild, or rethink our energy infrastructure, has the COVID crisis changed the perspective and planning in countries that have yet to fully build out this infrastructure? Has it set them on a different path?
Thank you, Chris. Environmental issues are in a range, from biodiversity to climate change. The environment's often given short shrift because of a clearly perceived rift between development and immediate need and the refusal to pay adequate heed to nature, where the damage would be greater, but the effects would be felt much later. And yet, after Paris, it is seen that Indian energy is getting more green. Both wind and solar are on a roll, and electric transportation is a goal. 2- and 3-wheelers are growing fast. 4-wheelers, though, may well be last. The COVID crisis is a pain, and yet there is so much to gain. At first, any major change will appear to be most strange, but then we can begin to see a striking opportunity. While all of us are badly burnt, indeed, there's much that we have learned. Work from home is now a breeze, and we can now gain a release from travel bills and office rent. Indeed, this time can be spent to reimagine and reinvent. On reforms we should be bent. And over time, I think we'll see a more enlightened policy. But businesses need not wait. On their own, they can be great. In the Godrej Group, it is seen that our goals of good and green, though ambitious, will be done. Sustainability can be won. And so, without partiality, our goal for all's neutrality, whether water, carbon, or solid waste, by 2020, we will make haste, make our net emissions zero. Will that make the group a hero? In 2010, the goal looked tall, but we took a reasoned call. Technology would save the day. So far, it has turned out that way. And gradually, we could see a step-by-step strategy. As technology takes a leap, green energy gets very cheap. At first, we thought we'd have to spend, but that's not true, for in the end, the more we bought, the more we slaved. We did invest, but we also saved. And solar will hit the goal of being cheaper than even coal in just a handful of years. Already, we and our peers are sourcing solar electricity at lower rates than the utility. For quite some time, we've been extorted as their finances still aren't sorted. A silver lining can be seen since it incentivizes green. Similar interest we can see throughout Indian industry. Neutrality can come with ease. Some may think that I'm a tease. All companies are not yet sold. For some it's tough, or so I'm told. Energy-intensive groups would say it's tougher then for them to play. If you can turn all waste to gold, and if you can be very bold, with inventing technology, any industry can see eventual neutrality. And now for a few comments. We need to change energy decisions to minimize our carbon emissions. Though green energy has taken a leap and become competitively cheap, so far the progress has been slow. Renewable energy at 15% now hardly seems to make a dent, or so we are told by Jim Falk in his very instructive talk. Malika posits that Shell will be a hero by 2050, clearly net zero, at least in their means of production. Will there be emissions reduction in the products by then as well? By then, will fossil fuels still sell or be replaced by energy that's clean, electricity and hydrogen that's green? The future belongs to technology. Fusion is something we might see. The technology of the future it has been. The cynics might say it'll always be seen as feasible, but way out there. But I don't think that's very fair. We now have the efforts of ITER. They're keeping their schedules tighter. Our dear friend Bernard Bigot is very clearly in the know. Let there be no confusion. Eventually, we will have fusion. Future of the planet's at stake, but with fusion, it's a piece of cake. We know that ITER will try, but we can't totally rely on their eventual success. Of course, we can consume much less. Efficiency is something we can stress. Now, many technologies are seen with the potential to be green. And Stan, in India, we can make a bid for many a solar microgrid. And with the spur, we can try more disruption through AI and digital for a system change. All this is now within our range. And indeed, Amy Luer's bets on new rules, powers, mindsets, then no dichotomy will be seen between growth and energy that's green. Thank you.
Wow. I don't know what to say. You say you set a new bar there. Anybody else is going to have to comment in rhyme. Well, look, I think that we have some themes that have emerged here, and I know this is a little bit of an experiment virtually here, but I'd like to open up sort of the discussion here. We do have one question, but we'll have a little bit of discussion. We have one question from the audience yet. We'll have some discussion first. The big theme obviously is stimulus and the opportunity there, but I'm also getting a theme of the sort of as Amy brought up and others, sort of grassroots versus policy, if you will, or grassroots versus top down. And so I wonder if particularly for Mr. Tanaka, but if we have other thoughts here, whether the grassroots is yet influencing the policy, if we're getting a demand signal from the population to take action. I don't know how you all feel, but I feel sort of just now catching my breath after all of the crisis over the past 6 to 8 months, and really thinking less about the present, less worry about my family, luckily, and a little bit more about the future. But I wonder if organization of grassroots and voters, I know you had an election, is influencing the sort of stimulus packages. Any other thoughts along those lines from everybody? Go ahead and chime in. You might be muted. Shigehiro, I think you're muted.
Okay.
There you go.
Well, thanks for the question. In terms of grassroots voices, I would maybe have to say, it's rather mixed. I think I cannot, deny the fact that, the COVID-19 situation itself is sort of, well, having its impact, and maybe the interest on climate change issues per se, maybe a little bit, weaker in some circumstances. But at the same time, the weather problems, we have had huge typhoons and all sorts of, weather disruptions that had, brought about, disasters all throughout the country from last year, and that has continued to help strengthen, I think, the people's view about the necessity to face these issues. And clearly, as a government, since we have already long-term plans of, addressing these things, it's more about, how we implement or continue to implement. And as I said, the will on the government side has not changed. But I think that's how I see the situation. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, we'll get some other thoughts, but Mr. Tsunakawa, have we seen a change in? Are you aware of a change in consumer demand for the kinds of things that they're interested in buying? Also, sort of consistent with what Amy said about in her comments.
Yes, I feel that our economic activity is very slow and stands still. It will take time to recover, I think.
I see. Yes, and do we have any data on obviously industry travel has impacted, but we're also using a lot more digital technology, a lot more computers. To what degree has sort of the digital world supplanted energy use of I guess I'd call it the more industrial side? Pavel, chime in too. I'm sorry, I see you raised your hand. We're learning this technology here while we go.
Yeah. Could I?
Yeah, please. Yeah. I think everyone. Let's just try it out.
Discussion about grassroots. I would like just to pitch in a little bit. I think it's extremely important to understand the balance between the grassroots and the regulatory framework which the government should be providing. I am now living just over the border from Switzerland in France, and maybe you have noticed how the discourse to engage the public in the overall discourse of the energy transition changed here after the demonstration we had a year ago. There is actually now a huge platform of the citizens and different agents from the society, which is advising President Macron about a way how the transition should happen. And Macron actually made a promise that he would implement without changes the proposal which is coming from this platform. In my home country, Netherlands, there is a similar discussion now. I mean, we have an energy kind of agreement, we call it energy accord. And I know that the leadership of that effort is now considering the similar kind of approach to have the more ownership of the bottom-up grassroots members of society of this plan. I understand the grassroots, by the way, also in a way, the private sector. I mean, over the last 10 years, I was involved so much in the discourse of the UN and intergovernmental, and I'm actually thinking that without recalibrating this partnership between the society, civil society, the private sector, and the governmental frameworks, I think we will not get anywhere. So I think we need a seriously relook into these grassroots initiatives. We also need to recalibrate the understanding of the partnership between the governmental, grassroots, private and public sector, and start all over again, because without it, I think we are just, beating a dead horse. Thank you.
Go ahead, Amy. Sorry, I cut out there just a little bit. I don't know. Go ahead, Amy. I think you're muted still.
About that, yes. Just to pick up on Pavel's comment and some of your comments previously, I think that one of the things that I hope that this process sort of pushes us over on is not just to think about how participatory engagement happens differently in the context of enabling grassroots, paying attention to the grassroots, the top down paying attention to the grassroots, and, listening, are those voices matter, but rather having us really rethink the relationship of grassroots to top down, rethink how we do, how we make decisions and how we govern, not how government is run, but how we govern. And I think that this moment, which is moving to be bigger than a moment, right? As we move into many months, but let's call it a moment in time nonetheless, has shooken us up and made us realize that, we can have conversations with more people involved. And how do we do that? And I think that there are a lot of other things that are happening in the digital space that are also allowing us to rethink that. And I think we still are stuck in this structure to say, okay, there are more voices online. How does this established governance system listen to them? We have these digital tools. How can we use them to bring it into our analog governance structure and do things tweak things here, tweak things there? I think we're at a stage where we have to really just reimagine how we govern our society. And, there are things that are going to happen. There's the COVID crisis. There are issues, for example, if we look forward, recently there was something announced about Climate Trace, which is this international collaboration of digital communities, satellite companies working together and making the projection that, by the next COP, in just months, really, they will have available in real time to everybody the emissions from the dominant sectors around the world. Now, whether it will be all sectors, whether it will be, fully available, I think the main point is that will be soon. And if that is soon, and you think about the types of governance issues that the structures we have now, we need a plan for that world. We need to set up a governance structure that can govern in that world, where everybody can communicate, where everybody can see all these different pieces. We're not setting up for the world tomorrow. We're setting up for the analog world of yesterday, and we need to change that.
And yeah, where it's sort of obvious where proximity is sort of irrelevant. And yet, we look, the sort of top-down big traditional government was able to pull together and do things like ITER, right? I mean, there's sort of so, okay, great.
Can I comment quickly on that? Because I actually am not saying that traditional government should go away. I'm just saying that we need to think about the role differently about these different pieces. I really want to be very clear that I'm not making the statement that,
right.
Because I thought that's how you interpreted it, and I want to clarify.
No, I get it. Go ahead, Bernard.
If I may, Chris, I do believe you're right. The grassroots is playing an increasing role. For example, in France, we see that with the COVID, the atmosphere of the city has been much cleaner, and so because you see no cars in the street, and so now the public is expecting real changes. But on the other side, I do believe there is expectation for a vision. Okay, what the government, maybe more largely, it could be offered, including explaining what technology could do. So from my point of view, I really believe that this crisis is a good illustration that there is an expectation for the large public to see the world offering a long-term vision. It is my understanding.
Right. Jim, do you see, as you look across these governance organizations, the impact of the digital the same way that Amy does?
Yes and no.
Or are they still sort of stuck in analog too, like the government?
Well, I think that there is huge big data capacity. The communication capacities are greatly increased. There's been a big learning curve on how to use those technologies. Yeah. And all of that is very positive. It doesn't, of course, change the political economic tensions which obstruct the allocation of authority and capacity to international institutions to get on with the job for which they are set up. But I do think it enables particularly a very important component, which is for the places where action on the various sorts of challenges that are coming up actually have to be responded to and implemented, which is in localities. It enables a much sharper and clearer connection between those localities and the people in them, and the global understanding and knowledge about what is emerging. And I think that's terribly important, that two-way flow. So I think that could result in an evolution in our governance structures, which would be very important.
Well, I have one question from the audience. Let me ask one question of Malika before I do that, and that is, it seems to me, as we heard from Pavel earlier, that there has been a dip. It hasn't been so great after all. So there's some opportunity space, if you will, for companies. I wonder, I wonder if one of the big energy companies is going to take the chance and drive the switch and sort of grab that sort of market, if you will, or are we all going to muddle through? Any thoughts there? For advanced energy, for a switch to to alternatives. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so that's very much sort of how we see the future playing out. And, it becomes all a question of timing and scaling, which is where you get into the grassroots, you get into political and policy frameworks that help move it along. I think, from the Shell perspective, we've got a long history in supplying energy. And that's great. And we build on that sort of capability, if you like. But a lot of the solutions that we would like to sell into sort of sectors that we operate in, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's around biofuels, whether it's around renewables, they're not always cost effective or cost competitive. So it's not enough for us to just stop at our boundaries on the supply side to say that we're going to, develop and push these solutions. We have to also work with our customers and to make sure that the demand side is also coming along, and there is a willingness and ability to take on these new fuels in these sectors like aviation, shipping, which are really hard to decarbonize. So we very much see a system approach that we have to be part of, where we shape the energy system of the future. Not just for ourselves, but also for our customers who are in the end have to take on these fuels and these solutions. So I think it is a time to rethink how we do it. So having the intention is great, but I think we also have to think through how is it that we deliver on that intention, and that requires, I think, quite a fundamental rethinking about how a company like Shell goes about advocating, not just on the supply side, but also for, changing the system in which our customers are operating. So I think that's a very big part of the pivot that we are doing. And that's a very big, it doesn't sound like much, but that's a big part of the change in mindset within a big company like Shell, from moving from an energy supplier to energy services provider.
Okay, super. I'm mindful of the time here, and we're ticking down a little bit, but I do have a question from the audience that maybe would be appropriate for Mr. Tsunakawa and perhaps Stan Whittingham. So, and I've paraphrased this a little bit. It's from Professor Yves Bamberger, who's a fellow at the National Academy for Technology in France. And let's assume that we have the political will to move the energy system to zero emissions as quickly as possible. Why are we focusing so much on production rather than technologies for the user side? Should we be emphasizing advanced energy technology for users more heavily? Either? Both? I think you're muted, Mr. Tsunakawa. You're muted. You're still. Go ahead, Stan.
Yes, I go first. I think if you look back a while, the technologies were more important a few years ago, and I look at the energy situation then. If you looked at laptops, the big issue was, do you make the chips more efficient or do you put bigger batteries in there? And I think in the end, you make the technology better, in other words, the electronics better, you get smaller batteries and smaller devices. So many of you may remember we called our portable computers laptops, but we couldn't put them on our laps 10 years ago. They got far too hot. Now there's no problem at all. So I think we need to look at the technology on the user side as well as what the energy as a whole can do. I was going to add one comment. No, I worked for a large oil company 45 years ago. And at that time, Exxon and it was Amoco, now part of BP, were going to be energy companies. And they started up large corporate labs. Exxon, I think, was the largest solar photovoltaic manufacturer in the United States. They did all the nuclear reprocessing for the government. We had a large fuel cell project with Alstom in France. And as you all know, we got the lithium battery idea going, and that's the one that in the end succeeded. But I think in a typical fashion, US industry wasn't interested in investing for 10 years. So Sanyo and Sony picked it up and ran with it in Japan.
Okay.
So
Well, let me, go ahead,
No.
Stan. Well, let me give Mr. Sunakawa a chance. And it's not a product placement, but my first laptop was a very nice Toshiba laptop.
Okay, demand side is important. So, for example, reducing urban power consumption, for example, that is one of the examples. So energy efficiency improvements are really single largest driver for CO2 emission reduction. So that part is important, and we are supporting that with our building energy management systems. But as a supply side, I'd like to also add the comment that renewable energy is important, or many batteries is important. But also, I think still nuclear power is continuously playing important role in energy side, I think. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we're sort of getting towards the end here. I do have just a little bit of a wrap up, but before we do that, I know we wandered far afield, but I want to take a simple vote. Pavel, easier or harder because of COVID?
Sorry, Chris, could you repeat the question?
Easier or harder because of COVID to reach energy and environmental goals?
I would prefer a question to score. How to change.
No, you got to make a choice.
I think
Up or down?
I think it's a draw at this moment.
Okay, draw. That's cheating. Jim.
It opens an opportunity, which
So it's easier.
makes it easier if grasped.
Easier. Okay, I like that. Optimistic. Stan, easier or harder?
I think it should be easier, particularly if we change things in November.
I'm not going there. Satoshi.
So easier. Let's be positive.
Easier. Okay. Bernard.
I do believe also easier because it's raise the awareness of the people that they have to really face the challenge of this large problem. So easier for me.
Right. We can see the mountains again in France, right? Amy.
Well, I don't like the easier or harder. I think framing, because it's still hard.
Yes.
But there's an opportunity to take on that hard challenge that I don't think we had before. But we have to recognize it's hard, and we have to put our investments now in the right spot.
Okay. I'll take that as a cautious easier. How's that? Shigehiro. You're muted. Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I think we should always work aiming toward making it easier. So I'll choose easier. Okay.
Okay. Nadir?
Definitely easier, because it opens up a lot of opportunities. We are ready to take collective action, and for all these reasons, easier.
I say easier too, and I wouldn't have guessed that
Malika,
from
you forgot Malika.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I?
Yes,
I did.
Malika.
I'm sorry, Malika.
I'm an optimist. I'm going to say easier. I think it
Easier.
provides a moment in time to reset or intensify action towards energy transition.
Right? Well, based on our prepared remarks and conversations, I would have guessed that more would vote harder, but I say easier too. So, all right. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, including poetry. We didn't have an interpretive dance, but maybe next time. I think that all of the panelists have recognized the value of the global pause to the environment, but of course at a tremendous cost, and we shouldn't obviously make light of that. So it's not so clear whether there's going to be a longer-term global reset. The opportunities there to change behavior, or maybe it's better said to not revert to our old behaviors, and of course to take advantage of the opportunity to leverage advanced technology. Perhaps made more acceptable if we choose to apply pandemic stimulus funds towards a better future. That's a luxury that wealthier nations perhaps can entertain, but of course, the principal reason for these stimulus packages, I think, in the minds of most politicians and governments right now, is to mitigate the immediate economic hardship and suffering. So I'd like to thank each of the panelists. Not just for their participation today, and this was fun, but also for participating in what I thought were very enjoyable preparatory sessions in the weeks leading up to this. And of course, once again, thank the STS Forum for bringing us all together to address this interesting question. So it's been fun, and I think we are exactly at time.
Thank you, Chris.
You.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Chris.